We're up to Dallas, which means we're also up to the Minnesota North Stars. And this board, I apologize right now for anybody with a cell phone. I assure you, these are words. I wrote stuff down on this board because I knew the trade history was going to be crazy. Because you look at them as an expansion team, and then you look at what happened after the Cleveland thing, and then you look at when they became Dallas, and just lots of stuff happened. So let's just start with the leading scorers. And I messed that up, but I just shoehorned somebody in. So number one on the list is Mike Modano with 557 goals, 802 assists, 1,359 points. The face of the Minnesota North Stars towards the end of the run, and the face of the Dallas Stars as well. Neil Broughton, 274 goals, 593 assists, 867 points, played for both Minnesota and Dallas. Brian Bellows, 342 goals, 380 assists, 722 points. Number four is right here. It's Dino Ciccarelli, 332 goals, 319 assists, 651 points. Number five, Jamie Benn. So Ben is going to pass Dino Ciccarelli to move into fourth, I would think, within the first week and a half of the season. 281 goals, 368 assists, 649 points. Bobby Smith, 185 goals, 369 assists, 554 points. Sergei Zubov, 111 goals, 438 assists, 549 points. Dave Gagne, 247 goals, 287 assists for 534 points. Brendan Morrow, 243 goals, 285 assists, 528 points. And Jiri Lehtinen, 243 goals, 271 assists, 514 points for a guy who's known for his defense more than his offense. The most interesting thing with Minnesota / Dallas, the team's name doesn't really change a whole lot. And the feeling that I've always had with the North Stars transition to the Stars is that it was probably the smoothest that we saw, and that the branding didn't really change. The jersey I'm wearing is from their first year in Dallas. All they did was put a Dallas patch here. This jersey they actually wore in Minnesota the last year in Minnesota. I mean, it was the last two seasons they had their jersey design changed. And there was a lot of rumors at the time that design change that took North off meant they were looking to move, which they were. They also wanted to rebrand a little bit because North Stars, even though we love those jerseys now, back then they weren't big sellers. Wins leaders, Marty Turco, 262, Kari Lehtinen, 216, Eddie the Eagle Belfour, 160, Cesar Maniago, 145, and Joe Malash with 141. So nice mix of Minnesota and Dallas there. Coaching wins, Ken Hitchcock, 319, Dave Tippett, 271, Glenn Sonmore, 177, Lindy Ruff, 165, and Bob Gainey is tied at that mark as well, 165. They're a team that have had some success. In Minnesota, they went to the finals in 1981 and 1991. They made the playoffs in 17 of 26 seasons. As Dallas, they've made the playoffs 15 of 26 seasons. So actually, Dallas has made the playoffs with less regularity than Minnesota. It is worthy of note, and you put the asterisk there, that you make the playoffs less when there's 31 teams or 30 teams than when there's 21. So that's to be factored in there as well. They moved in 1993, and Norm Green initially looked at Los Angeles. He wanted to move a team into the Honda Center, which was being built, but the National Hockey League went to him and said, hey, Disney wants to come in. They want to bring in their own team. Would it be okay with you to go ahead and put this on the back burner because we have this idea to have a team there as an expansion team? And Norm Green went, sure. So the Ducks stood in his way, and then in January of 1993, Dallas is tagged as where he's going to send the team. And this was a team that when they moved, there was a lot of dislike put towards the Minnesota North Stars owner. Yeah, Norm Greed was his nickname. And when you look at the reasons for the move, poor attendance is cited, and the attendance in Minnesota was miserable the last couple of years. They did not have a lease for their building. And also there was a sexual harassment lawsuit, and his wife said, you got to move. I don't want to be around here anymore. You got to get out of here. So that's a perfectly okay. And this is the weird one. They could have played in Target Center where the Minnesota Timberwolves were, but they had a deal to have Coke on tap, and the North Stars had a deal with Pepsi. So it would be weird if that was the straw that broke the camel's back. We'd love to stay, but they drink Coke in the Timberwolves arena, at which point I would jump up and yell, of course they do, because it's better than Pepsi. So, apologies to all the Pepsi fans out there. I already earned some downvotes. So Green takes the team to Dallas, but he doesn't stick around. He ends up having to sell the team to Tom Hicks in 1996, and so Green's out. So he moves the team to make more money, and I can't make money. I'm in trouble, and I'm got to sell. And so, of course, as the Dallas Stars, they make the Stanley Cup Finals in 2000, and they win it all in 1999. They were very close to winning it again in 2000, being back-to-back champs, but what are you going to do? Interesting sort of a side note, and it really shouldn't be, and at some point I'll do another video on this. I'm pretty sure I've done a video on the Cleveland Barons before and when they dissolved. But it's interesting because on June 14th, 1978, they were merged with the Cleveland Barons. But what's interesting is the Guns, who owned the Barons, would become the owners of the Sharks, with the idea that they were going to bring hockey back to the Bay at some point, because it's going to work. Oakland didn't work, but it's going to work. So the idea was that they would take all the Cleveland players and make them Minnesota North Stars, and Minnesota should get better, right? Because it's 2 teams worth of players. Not really. They went from 45 points to 68. So the fledgling Minnesota North Stars still kind of fledgling a year later, and they still weren't in the playoffs with 68 points. So adding a whole team of players only added 23 points. Although, that being said, there were deals that got made at the time. We'll look at a couple of those. But basically, this is a team that had a tumultuous existence. And then in 93, they moved to Dallas, and it kind of settles down after that. Top 10 draft picks. So we'll do the draft picks first, and then we'll get into the captains. Draft picks, 1967, they draft 4th. They draft Wayne Cheeseman. 1968, they draft 5th, and Jim Benzelock is their number 5 draft pick. 1969, they draft 5th as well, Dick Redmond. 1974, they draft 6th. Doug Hicks goes 6th overall. 1975, they draft 4th. It's Brian Maxwell. 1976, they draft 3rd. Glenn Sharpley. 1977, they draft at the number 7 spot. Brad Maxwell goes there. All 3 Maxwells ended up playing for them. And I'm pretty sure that Brad and Brian were brothers. I don't think Kevin was related. 1978, Bobby Smith's drafted 1st overall. 1979, Craig Hartsburg is drafted 6th, and Tom McCarthy is drafted 10th. 1982, Brian Bellows is drafted in the number 2 spot. 1983, they draft 1st, and they draft Brian Lawton. That, of course, is remembered as one of the biggest busts of a number 1 draft pick, and he was. I've argued to defend Gord Kluzak as being a guy who was injury-riddled, not really a flop. In Lawton's case, I can't really make a defense. Was he rushed to the NHL? Maybe. But his NHL-level skill was not what was expected of a number 1 draft pick. 1987, they draft 6th overall, and Dave Archibald of Chilliwack ends up getting drafted 6th. 1988, Mike Modano goes at number 1. 1989, Doug Smolek goes at number 7. 1990, Darian Hatcher goes at 8. And 1991, they draft Richard Matvechuk at 8. Notice the Minnesota North Stars are drafting in the top 10 a lot. A ton. The Dallas Stars in black have not. 1993, so that first year, Todd Harvey's drafted 9th. 1996, they draft 5th, Richard Jackman. 2009, drafting 8th, they draft Scott Glennie. And I remember Scott Glennie being very, very well scouted, and he was going to be great, and then it just didn't work. 2013, they draft 10th, Valeri Nichushkin, and of course he is gone from Dallas at this stage. And 2017, drafting 3rd, Miro Heiskanen. Of all of the top 10 draft picks since they went to Dallas, Heiskanen looks like the absolute best one of the bunch. So, definitely a smart move drafting him 3rd for Dallas. But a lot of these other draft picks, there's some flops in there. When they've drafted 1st, it's been Modano and Smith, but in the middle you got Lawton. So 2 out of 3 ain't bad, according to Meatloaf, and I guess according to the Stars. Captains. So again, I color coded them. The ones in green are Minnesota. Bob Wojtowicz. Sorry, Bob Wojtowicz. 1967 to 68. Elmer Vasco, 68-69. Claude LaRose, 69-70. Ted Harris is the captain from 70 to 74. Bill Goldsworthy, 74 to 76. Nick Hogaboam, 76-77. Or Bill Hogaboam. Nick Beverly, 77-78. J.P. Parise, 78-79. Paul Schmier, 79 to 80. Tim Young, 81 to 82. Craig Hartsburg, 82 to 89. Kurt Giles, 89 to 91. And Mike Tinordi, I should say, 91 to 93. And then when they moved to Dallas, he maintains his captaincy right through to 95. Neil Broughton, captain as well in 95. Darian Hatcher, 95 to 2003. Mike Modano finally gets the captaincy in 2003, right through to 2006. Brendan Morrow, 2006 to 2013. And Jamie Benn, who's been captain since 2013. And he'll be captain until his time in Dallas is done. So it's not as ugly a picture with captains as it has been for some of the teams I've covered so far. There's turnover the first 4 years, which is kind of to be expected with expansion franchises for the most part. But in general, pretty stable. From Tinordi to Hatcher, Modano, Morrow, and Ben, pretty decent captains and pretty good runs for all of them. And Darian Hatcher was one of my favorites. I don't think I've done a video on him. I would probably do a video on both Hatcher brothers. But that being said, let's move along to the notable trades list, and this is where even I may need a magnifying glass on this one. And I apologize for that right off the hop because, yeah. And again, these are relatively big trades that I couldn't just ignore. Let's get into it. June 7th, 1967, Minnesota acquires Bill Masterton. Montreal gets cash. Masterton, of course, ends up dying tragically. Good Minnesota North Stars player prior to that, and it is a noteworthy deal for both the tragic reason, and he was a pretty good player for them. February 27th, 1970, Gump Worsley is sold to Minnesota in that they gave money to Montreal. So Montreal, we got a player available. Minnesota goes, we'll take him. Which is a smart move at the time because Montreal's a machine and Minnesota is not. August 15th, 1975, Minnesota acquires Tim Young. The LA Kings acquire 1976 second rounder. I'll go ahead and give the victory on that trade to Minnesota. Tim Young was I really enjoyed Tim Young a lot. Good player. August 23rd, 1976, Gary Smith gets moved to Minnesota. He gets traded a lot. Vancouver, Cesar Maniago goes to Vancouver. And Gary Smith just walked out on the Canucks. Just, I'm done. Out of here. And he ended up in Minnesota after that. Maniago had a decent little run with Vancouver. And Smith moved along a lot. October 18th, 1978, Minnesota acquires a first-round draft pick from the Capitals. Becomes Tom McCarthy. And Washington gets Dennis Maruk. So when they acquire the Barons and the merge is taking place, before they've played with Maruk in their lineup a whole lot, they decide we're going to get rid of this guy. Maruk just scores 60 in a season with the Capitals. So I'll go ahead and give the victory in this trade to the Capitals because if you're younger than 30, you don't know who Tom McCarthy is. And to be honest, if I didn't collect hockey cards so much in the 80s, I probably wouldn't remember Tom McCarthy either. August 9th, 1979, Minnesota acquires a 1979 second-round draft pick, which becomes Neil Broughton. A third-round pick, which becomes Kevin Maxwell. Like I said, if your last name is Maxwell, you probably played for the North Stars. Edmonton acquired Dave Semenko and a 1979 third, which became Mark Messier. I'm going to go ahead and say the Oilers won that trade. I know it's going out on a limb to say that Messier was better than Broughton, but he was. And, Semenko, like if Semenko and Messier had been in the Minnesota North Stars lineup, who knows how the 80s turn out, right? August 21, 1981, Minnesota acquires the number 1 draft pick, which becomes Brian Bellows. And Detroit acquires Greg Smith and a 1982 first, which becomes Murray Craven, and the rights to Don Murdoch. So again, Brian Bellows being the best guy in that trade, I'll go ahead and say that Minnesota ended up winning that deal overall. October 28th, 1982, Minnesota acquires George Ferguson and the first overall draft pick, which they used for Lawton, as I stated previously. And in exchange for that draft pick, Pittsburgh gets Anders Hackinson, Ron Meehan, and a 1983 first that became Bob Airy. So Bob Airy kind of had a better career than Brian Lawton. I got to give that trade to Pittsburgh. On June 21st, 1984, the Minnesota North Stars acquire Harold Snepsts. Vancouver acquires Al McAdam. And if you're going to say, that's not a big deal, it was to Vancouver at the time. Harold Snepsts was kind of the identity on that blue line. And when he went to Minnesota, there were some upset fans around here. June 15th, 1985, Minnesota acquires Kent Nilsson and a 1986 third-round draft pick. The Calgary Flames acquire a second-round draft pick in 85, which was Joe Nieuwendyk, and a 1987 second-round draft pick, which became Stefan Matteau. I'm going to go ahead and say Calgary won that deal. Minnesota not winning on the trade front very often. March 2nd, 1987, Minnesota acquires Cash and a 1988 second-round pick, which became Link Gates. And Edmonton acquired Kent Nilsson. So Joe Nieuwendyk and Stefan Matteau are turned into Link Gates and some money. And Link Gates was one of the toughest players who ever played in the National Hockey League. Probably not worth Nieuwendyk and Matteau. And of course, if you're like, when did Link Gates play for Minnesota? Right, he ends up in San Jose. So they kind of ended up with nothing there. And you wonder why Minnesota ended up being mediocre for so long. January 3rd, 1988, Minnesota acquires Kurt Fraser. Chicago acquires Dirk Graham. Chicago wins that trade. October 11th, 1988, Minnesota acquires Paul Gerard, Mark Tinordi. Yeah, it's Mark Tinordi. I don't know why it said Mike over there. Sorry about that. Mike Sullivan, a 1989 third-round pick, which was Murray Garbett. And New York acquires Brian Lawton, Igor Liba, and Rick Bennett. I guess there has to be at least one typo on the board, or it's not a hockey guy board. It's not really a hockey guy board without that one typo. So yeah. Yeah, Mike Tinordi. My God. Anyways. Minnesota wins this deal because Tinordi was fantastic. And really, Mark Tinordi was that beast on the blue line that they absolutely had to have. And then they had Darian Hatcher throwing around checks too. Dallas was tough to play when they became Dallas. Minnesota was tough to play at times. Okay, January 22nd, 1990, the Minnesota North Stars acquired Daniel Bandit Berthiaume from Winnipeg for futures. So for people who are watching my year-by-year history videos, that's where Bandit ends up. March 7th, 1989, don't want to miss this one. Minnesota acquires Mike Gartner and Larry Murphy. Washington acquires Dino Ciccarelli and Bob Rouse. And Ciccarelli had to go. Gartner was a nice return. He doesn't last in Minnesota for very long. But Larry Murphy was a good ad as well, and he doesn't last in Minnesota very long either. So there's some ADD going on with this team, and it's frustrating because you see there's pretty good players. And in Murphy's case, he ends up winning Stanley Cups, just not in Minnesota, obviously. March 6, 1990, Minnesota acquires Alf Dahlen, a 1990 fourth, a 1991 fourth, and the Rangers acquire Mike Gartner. So they have turned Ciccarelli and Rouse into Murphy, a couple of fourth rounders, and Alf Dahlen. Dahlen has a pretty solid run as a member of the Minnesota North Stars, and so I can't really complain too much about that, but again, Gartner doesn't last very long. August 21st, 1990, Minnesota acquires a 1992 fourth round pick, which becomes Jari Lehtinen. And Boston acquires Ken Hodge Jr. So this is a deal that looks like a huge steal for Boston a year out, but by the time you look at this 5 years later, you go, wow, that was a pretty smart move by Minnesota, even though At the time, it was just a fourth rounder they got back because Leighton has a pretty solid career with Minnesota/Dallas. December 11th, 1990, Minnesota acquires Chris Dahlquist and Jim Johnson. Pittsburgh acquires Larry Murphy and Peter Taglianetti. There's not a lot to unpack here. Pittsburgh wins that deal. So now they've turned Dino Ciccarelli and Bob Rouse into a lot of pieces. But at the end of the day, the more talented players are the ones going the other way. June 22nd, 1991, and I remember loving this trade at the time. This was a three-way deal. Craig Ludwig goes to the Minnesota North Stars. Tom Kurvers goes to the New York Islanders. Dave Babich goes to Vancouver. Kurvers defensively was a mess. Babich was not. Babich came in. Babich was older. Seen as kind of broken down, but he'd have a resurgence as a member of the Vancouver Canucks. And for Minnesota, Ludwig was a pretty good pickup too. August 31st, 1992, Minnesota acquires Russ Courtnall. Montreal acquires Brian Bellows. This is a deal that, I'll call it a saw-off. I'll call it a 50-50 trade. Now we move to trades involving Dallas. So, yeah. You can go ahead and get yourself a glass of water if you'd like. Now we're moving to Dallas trades. Whew. And you can see Minnesota's trade record is spotty at best. It's spotty. You look at trades that they won, it's almost accidental if they won it. So Dallas, June 22nd, 1993, they acquire Gord Murphy and Andy Moog from Boston for John Casey. That's a win for Dallas. John Casey had a really, really solid run for the Minnesota North Stars, and then it just sort of, I don't know, it didn't last. I loved Casey, and then it just didn't last with him. January 18th, 1995, Dallas acquires Kevin Hatcher. Washington acquires Rick Mrozik and Mark Tinordi. This was a deal that, of course, I was torn on because I didn't want to see Tinordi go. But at the same time, having the Hatcher brothers together, that was kind of fun. 100% kind of fun. February 27th, 1995, Dallas acquires Corey Millen. The New Jersey Devils acquire Neil Broughton. And, of course, Broughton would play a pretty major role with the New Jersey Devils getting to the Stanley Cup. So you're welcome, New Jersey. And Corey Millen, while I like the kid, yeah. So anyways, April 7th, 1995, Dallas acquires Greg Adams, Dan Kessa, and a 1995 fifth-round pick. Vancouver acquires Russ Courtnall. I like that trade for Dallas a lot. Russ Courtnall, having the Courtnall brothers together, I was kind of excited about that. And then Jeff, of course, left after that season, so you didn't really get to see them together a whole lot. And Greg Adams had some pretty good runs with Dallas. October 2nd, 1995, Dallas acquires Guy Carbonneau. St. Louis acquires Paul Broughton. I'm going to go ahead and say Dallas wins that deal, as Guy Carbonneau was a better player than Paul Broughton. Carbonneau, the older player, but still the better player. December 19th, 1995, Dallas acquires Joe Nieuwendyk. So that's the trade that's the draft pick they gave Calgary. And in exchange, they give Calgary Jerome McGinley and Corey Millen. So that's a trade that you can look at and say, well, Calgary wins that. Absolutely. However, Nieuwendyk is a pretty major player for Dallas when they win the Stanley Cup in 1999. So if you're going to measure it by cups, Dallas wins the deal. If you're going to measure it by who had a fantastic career, Calgary won that deal. And I can't stand here and make the argument that if McGinley's in the Dallas lineup and Nieuwendyk isn't in 99, that somehow we don't win a Stanley Cup. June 22nd, 1996, Dallas acquires Sergei Zubov. Pittsburgh acquires Kevin Hatcher. So the Hatcher brothers don't last very long in Dallas, but it was fun while it lasted. And Zubov, pretty solid run for him in Dallas. Thank you, New York Rangers. Or Pittsburgh in this case, sorry. He went from Rangers, Pittsburgh, and then Dallas, right? There's a lot of stuff on the board. I took over 2 hours writing all this up, and I still have Mike Tinordi on the board. That's a fail. That's 100% fail. That's what that is. June 27, 1998, the Dallas Stars acquired 2 second-round draft picks in the 1998 draft, neither of whom had long careers in the NHL. And the New Jersey Devils got a first-round pick back, which became Scott Gomez, a kind of forgotten player in that he had that massive contract he didn't live up to. But up until then, he got the massive contract because he was a pretty darn good player. March 19th, 2002, Dallas acquires Jason Arnott, Randy McKay, and a 2002 first-round pick, which is Daniel Paille. New Jersey acquires Jamie Langenbrunner and Joe Nieuwendyk because Nieuwendyk's not done winning Stanley Cups. And Langenbrunner, one of my all-time favorite Dallas Stars. Shame to see him go because when you've got the name Jamie Langenbrunner, you have to be a hockey player. I would think you have to be a hockey player. June 21st, 2003, Dallas acquires the second round pick, which is 36th overall, 54th, which becomes BJ Crombeen. Anaheim acquires a first, number 30 overall, which they used to draft Corey Perry. When you see these deals on draft day, sometimes they become pretty major deals. And you look at the team that acquired the extra pick, which in this case was Dallas, and you say, you gave up on who was the best player to get two guys, and the best of those two guys was BJ Crombeen. So it's a tricky thing to do. June 26, 2004, Dallas acquires a 2005 fifth-round pick. Vancouver acquires a 2004 third-round pick. So it's a 2005 third, 2004 third, and in that 2004 draft, at that spot, Vancouver acquires Alex Edler. They draft Alex Edler, and of course, he's had a pretty decent career. So again, when somebody calls you at the draft table and go, hey, can we get that draft pick off you? There's somebody there who might end up being an NHLer. For a lot of the time, they end up being just nothing trades, but sometimes they end up being pretty darn important. February 26, 2008, Dallas acquires Johan Holmquist and Brad Richards from Tampa. And Richards being traded from Tampa is crazy. And then the amount of money Richards ends up making after is just crazy too. Tampa Bay acquires Jeff Halpern, Jussi Jokinen, Mike Smith, and a 2009 fourth-round draft pick. And of course, Mike Smith was brought in by Tampa with the idea that he'd be their starting goalie. And there were mixed results there before he's moved on to Arizona. July 8th, 2009, Dallas acquires Alex Auld. Why does this matter? Because the sixth-round draft pick they gave to Ottawa used to draft Mark Stone. Watch those draft picks. February 9th, 2010, Dallas acquires Kari Lehtinen. Atlanta acquires Ivan Vishnevsky and a 2010 fourth-round pick. Lehtinen came in, I believe it was as a rental, and then signed a deal with Dallas. That's why Atlanta gave up Lehtinen for so little. And I'll also add, Lehtinen had injury problems as well. So when he signed a deal with Dallas after that, I got really nervous. I thought, okay, so looks like he's going to be the starter. He gets injured a lot, and his numbers are kind of mediocre. Let's see how it turns out. And honestly, Lehtinen had some pretty good seasons in there. He was a pretty good starter at times. It ended kind of ugly, but he had some pretty good years in there. All right, moving along. February 21st, 2011, Dallas acquires Alex Goligoski. Pittsburgh acquires James Neal and Matt Niskanen. And of course, Niskanen has had a pretty solid career for himself since leaving Minnesota, and it's not enough of a return to get Alex Goligoski, who is now, of course, in Arizona. July 4th, 2013. I was going to say 2013, and then I went in the middle and turned it to twa. And again, these videos get kind of long. And again, over 2 hours on this board last night, which is why I'm doing this today, because I can't have cats rubbing up against the board and wiping out the text. They do that a lot with this board. It's huge. It's hard to get past it. So July 4th, 2013, Dallas acquires Tyler Seguin, Rich Peverly, and Ryan Button. Boston acquires Louis Eriksson, Joe Morrow, Riley Smith, and Matt Fraser. It's a trade that looks awful right now. At the time, it wasn't that bad, and Eriksson had a pretty good run with Boston. And Riley Smith had a couple of good years for Boston as well. The trick with this was Joe Morrow never reached that level he was supposed to, and Matt Fraser, who was a great scoring star in the AHL, it never translated at National Hockey League level. I thought the move to Boston would help Fraser, and it didn't. So, a guy who was a pretty good sniper in the American League, and this is why when people say, hey, why aren't you talking about this player? He put up a lot of points in the AHL last year. It's guys like Matt Fraser that cause me to say, all right, that's great, but it doesn't mean it translates to the National Hockey League. July 1st, 2014. So July, it's time to make another trade. Jason Spezza and Ludwig Karlsson are acquired by Dallas in exchange for Alex Chason, Alexander Guptill, Nick Paul and a 2015 second-round draft pick. And I remember Ottawa fans not being happy with the return for Spezza. Spezza moving out of Ottawa, pretty expected. That being said, the return was underwhelming. I think that the key to that one was Chason, and he never really did much. He changed it to Chiasson while he was in Ottawa, but that was just obnoxious. When he's not playing in Ottawa, he's just Chason. So at Edmonton, he's Chason again. So there you go. And in Calgary, he was Chason. In Washington, Chason, but he goes to Ottawa and Chiasson. Oh, okay. Not that it bothers me, of course, right? May 9th, 2017, Dallas acquires Ben Bishop from LA for a 2017 fourth round pick. So this is your classic rental. And of course, Bishop signs a long-term deal. And when you look at that now, you go, wow, what a steal for Dallas. But there was the risk that they wouldn't be able to re-sign him. So you can look and say LA sold low. But LA didn't really need Bishop. They have lots of goalies, including a Jonathan Quick guy who's pretty good when he's healthy. And so Bishop gets moved on to Dallas. And then February 23rd of 2019, this was a deal from this past trade deadline. Matt Zuccarello is traded to Dallas. The two conditional draft picks, a second-round draft pick this year, a 2020 third, both would have bumped up to firsts, according to what I was reading, if Zuccarello had stayed in Dallas. So if Zuccarello had signed a contract with Dallas, that's a first-round draft pick, but because it's a rental, they're not first-round draft picks. So there you go. There's the trade history of the Minnesota North Stars and Dallas Stars. And again, of all the franchises that have moved, this feels just the most natural. That they kept the same name, they kept the same identity, they were able to win a Stanley Cup, whereas Minnesota didn't. They've both played 26 seasons, 2 Stanley Cup Finals. This one, it's separated by 10 years. 17 playoffs, 15 playoffs. Not as many top 10 draft picks for Dallas as we saw with Minnesota, but all those draft picks didn't help Minnesota a whole lot either. So while they were a team that in the early 80s were seen as a power in the National Hockey League, they never really reached back to where they were in 81. The 81 Stanley Cup Final turned out to be kind of a mirage. And 91 was one of those ultimate underdog situations where a team that should not be in the playoffs, a team that would not have been in the playoffs in today's NHL, they would have been down like 28th or 29th in today's NHL. But because of the system the way that it was in the NHL back then, they got hot at the right time, and despite being a miserable team in the regular season, they went to the Stanley Cup Final in 91. So there you go. The history of the Minnesota/Dallas franchise. North Stars or Stars. And let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And by all things that are holy, I would have started the video over based on the Mike Tinordi being on the board instead of Mark Tinordi. But it's a long video. So I want crap. I'm going to just have to keep it in there. There you go. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I'll talk to you again soon.